Hello and welcome to Tiny Faces, the show where we paint tiny portraits on tiny canvases. Today we'll be tackling one of the most iconic movie monsters of all time, the Bride of Frankenstein. Right now I'm prepping my work surface to get it ready for painting, and along the bottom of the screen are all the colors I'll be using if you'd like to follow along. The work surface is a piece of chipboard that I cut into a 4x4 inch square, with a 2x2 inch square marked out in pencil in the center. The 1-inch border around the 2x2 square, as well as the pencil marks, have been covered in a thin layer of matte medium to keep the tape I'm using from tearing the chipboard when it's removed. The tape is a regular, low-tack painter's tape, and I'm using it to keep the edges of the painting crisp and clean. You can work without it if you'd like. What I like to do after putting the painter's tape on is to go in and really press down with my fingernail along the edges of the tape where it meets the pencil lines. This helps to keep any wayward paint from getting under the tape and ruining the clean edges that I'm going for. Once the surface has been prepped, I like to put the paint onto a wet palette. Now, the wet palette, as opposed to a regular palette, basically uses a sponge underneath a semi-permeable paper, and the paper stays damp while the sponge is wet, allowing the paint to extend its drying time much longer. I'm using Liquitex heavy-body acrylic paints, and I like using them because they have a good amount of pigment, are pretty easy to use, and clean up with just soap and water. One of the best aspects to acrylics is that once they're dry, any mistakes can just be painted over, and believe me, I make plenty of mistakes even in this painting here. To start the painting, I'm going to load a No. 2 flat shade brush with Prussian blue and begin to sketch the subject out. I keep the sketch pretty loose, as I don't want to lock in any details too early. Doing that will just make it harder for me to correct them later. One thing that you'll notice as I'm sketching this painting is that I'm constantly going back over lines that I've already made. That's because I'm always thinking about the relationship between these pieces. The forehead, the nose, the chin, the neck, the ears, and rejudging how they fit in together. Does the distance between them look correct? Does the shape of it look correct? And if it doesn't, I'll just go ahead and try to fix it right there. It's a really nice skill to develop because it allows you to look at your painting more objectively rather than thinking that every mark you make is permanent. Oh, and everyone, here is my cat Scribbles. I suppose he decided to help me out today, so he jumped on my back, perhaps to remind me of man's connection to nature. Kinda threw off my flow a little bit, I will admit, but that's okay. The guy is pretty cute, so I'll forgive him. Once I'm happy with the outline of the bride, I'm going to go ahead and start blocking out where I think the eyes, hairline, jawline, etc. should be. Like before, I'm constantly checking these objects with the objects that have already been sketched, as well as against each other. Does the eye to the nose distance look okay? Does the hairline to the jawline look alright? Does the ear to the chin look okay? And if any of those look off to me, I'm going to correct that now. I'm also going to block in the hair, this great mass of dark hair, because, for me at least, it will give me a better sense of where the hair is in relation to the rest of the face, much more than a single line could. Now that I'm happy with my sketch, I'm going to start blocking in the midtones with the light blue-violet. While my choice of colors you might find interesting, I actually enjoy using these three colors together. They complement each other very well as having clearly defined roles within the painting. The Prussian blue is good for sketching, but it's also great for the dark shadows. Light blue-violet for the midtones and lighter shadows, while the parchment is our light tone for use where the light is strongest on the face. It's just a really pleasing color palette to work with, and the pops of red and yellow we'll be adding later really help each color stand out. With our midtones painted in, I'm going to wash my brush off and start using the parchment to define the portrait's light areas. The light areas on this subject are anything that the light source would be strongest on, and for the Bride of Frankenstein, because of her makeup, it actually makes it a little bit easier on us because much of her face is going to have a bright light on it, and we won't have to worry about too many deep shadows on the face. You might have seen me start to do this earlier, but at this point in the painting, I'm going to go back in with the Prussian blue and light blue violet and revisit some of the areas that I now feel need a little bit more definition, such as the eyes and lips. I also use this opportunity to shape the edges of the shadows and get them to about where I want them to be. I also jump between all of these areas so I don't wind up too focused on one and overwork it. You can also see me using the Prussian blue to define the edge of the face. This is going to help it stand out from the background when we eventually paint that in with the light blue violet. I'm going to keep repeating this process and keep swapping between the three colors to help hone in these features and get them to a more finalized state. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd like to address something that I've heard occasionally from people that are watching me paint, and that is the question, why don't you use white? And really, the answer is that I find off-white colors to be much more natural and help sell the illusion of whatever it is you're painting. Very few things in nature are purely one color. Grass, for instance, isn't just green, it's often yellow and brown, occasionally red and orange if leaves happen to fall in the autumn. It's the same with the sky. The sky is often not just one blue, it's usually multiple different shades of blue. And when the sun sets or rises, it can even get some very intense purples, oranges, and pinks. And it's the same with white. Very few things in nature are pure white, if at all. And even if we think they are, the reality is that there's going to be something underneath, above, or reflected off that white that will subtly change how we perceive that color. If we take snow, for example, as something pure white, imagine these two different scenarios. One is that you're observing snow in the prairies of Wyoming, and the other is the same, but this time you're in downtown New York. The snow on the prairie is going to look so different than the snow in the city, but they're both using the same white snow. Snow on the prairie is going to be much closer to that pure white, but it's going to be reflecting the sun and sky as well as showing some of the grass and earth underneath it. The city snow is going to be much grayer, darker, because it's lying on top of all that asphalt and concrete, and not to mention all of the people and tires that will be making their marks on it. And because of all this, a pure white paint next to another color can look off, even if the painting is of something unrealistic such as this one. We don't really expect pure white to be on someone's face because faces have skin, muscle, and blood. It can reflect other colors. So, needless to say, it can just look odd. This isn't to say that you shouldn't use white if it works for you, but rather to make you think about why you are choosing that white. Are you picking it because it complements the color palette of your piece? Or are you picking it because that's what bright light should look like? I'd like to take a moment to talk about today's subject, as I find the Bride of Frankenstein to be a really interesting character with a fascinating history. How her role in popular culture has become so entrenched, despite really only appearing in one movie, is an impressive feat for any character, and much less one tied to such a specific genre. In Mary Shelley's original 1818 novel, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, the Bride of Frankenstein is barely even a character. She's not given a name, has no dialogue, and might not even really exist. Really, all she does is to serve as a subplot to Victor Frankenstein and his creation's conflict over whether or not the creation has humanity and empathy. Now, how the bride comes to be in the original novel is that the creation has gone through its short existence only experiencing depression, anger, violence, and wants his creator Victor Frankenstein to make another version of him, this time a female, to make someone to make someone that the creature can love unconditionally and will love him back in the same way. Initially, Victor promises that he will give his creation this wish, that he will make another creature despite his reservations. But when Victor starts to assemble the parts for the new creature, he begins to have second thoughts and reflects on his decision. He realizes that a new being won't necessarily make the creature happy, that there's no guarantee the new being will love the creature or even want to be around him. There's a real chance that they will find the monster just as repulsive as everyone else seems to. In a moment that I think has dated itself pretty poorly, Victor also thinks that should these two creatures mate, they will create a new race that will threaten humanity and its future generations. I think this part of the novel raises the question, among others, as to how Victor could even know that these two could procreate at all, considering that they're made from dead tissue. Also, it's a missed opportunity, as the book could have addressed the idea of what it means to be human if you don't have reproductive rights. But perhaps that kind of topic wasn't even on the radar in 1818. Ultimately, Victor destroys this new creation that he's working on, as unfinished as it is, and the monster, who has been following Victor to make sure he keeps his promise, sees this and becomes enraged. Her destruction becomes the catalyst for the rest of the novel, as the monster, now sure that he can't trust humanity, swears vengeance and begins to hunt most of Victor's family down, killing in cold blood. Even though the book would be adapted numerous times, it would take 117 years before Frankenstein's second creation was explored in any detail. Though the sequel to Universal's Frankenstein adaptation wound up having a very troubled history, if it wasn't for that fact, we probably wouldn't have the Bride that we know today. Universal wanted to capitalize on their success with their 1931 Frankenstein movie and instantly started on a sequel called The Return of Frankenstein, with the intention of releasing it in either 1932 or 33. The initial treatment of the movie called for both Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, which would have been fascinating to see both actors in their prime on screen in the same Frankenstein film. But the Returns version of the Bride would have been so different than the version we know today that she would have been almost unrecognizable. The script called for the Bride to be made from, quote, the oversized head of a circus freak and women's body parts recovered from a train wreck, end quote. And while that might sound pretty tame by today's horror standards, and I must admit I would love to see that version come to life one day, for the standards of the early 30s, it was far too gruesome and scandalous to actually be made. So the script went back and forth, going through multiple rewrites and treatments before the director of the first Frankenstein, James Whale, agreed to take the helm of this movie in 1934. Whale cast Elsa Lanchester as both the Bride and Mary Shelley, and she brings a wonderful presence to both characters. The character of the Bride, and especially her hair, was designed to resemble the statues of Egyptian pharaohs. As the Bride, her scars are given much less prominence than that of Frankenstein's monster, and almost seem to accentuate her features rather than deform them. The movie itself is mostly told through two stories. One in which Victor Frankenstein, ill and bedridden, is visited by a former professor, Dr. Pretorius, and convinced not to abandon his work. The second is Frankenstein's monster, having survived the burning windmill, finding his way back to Castle Frankenstein and his encounters along the way. The two plots converge when the monster finds Dr. Pretorius exhuming a body in an underground crypt. Pretorius isn't frightened of the monster, and in a rather humorous scene by today's standards, shares his lunch and a cigar with the monster. During their lunch, Pretorius reveals his plan to create a partner for the monster, and with the efforts of Victor, Pretorius, and two murderers, the bride is brought to life. When the monster approaches her, though, the bride hisses, afraid of the creature. Sadly, the monster ultimately realizes that even his new bride cannot love him, and destroys the tower therein with a huge explosion, presumably killing himself, the bride, and Dr. Pretorius. And thus, a horror icon was born. However, even though the movie was named after her, what fascinates me about the film is that the bride only appears in it for 4 minutes. She has no dialogue, only communicates by hissing. We get no sense of her internal life, what she thinks or understands about herself or humanity. But such is the strength of her look that she entered the pantheon of horror icons. Throughout the decades, the character has been expanded on and parodied through films, TV series, novels, comics, among others, but the character remains as popular as ever. It really goes to show that exceptional production design really is timeless. Premiering in San Francisco on April 19, 1935, and followed by a general release the next day, Bride of Frankenstein received positive reviews from contemporary critics from publications such as Time magazine, The New York Times, Variety, and The Daily Herald, among others. A reviewer from Harrison's Reports was particularly positive about the film, writing, quote, "Artistically, this surpasses Frankenstein. Production, direction, and acting are excellent. The most effective part of the picture is not the horror situations, but the more human ones, those in which Karloff is befriended by O.P. Heggie. Karloff's happy reaction to such treatment is touching." End quote. Even though the movie went over its estimated production budget and was not as big of a success as its predecessor, it was still a profitable movie for Universal. But despite all this, The Bride would never be featured in a Universal monster movie again. So, if the movie was a success, both financially and critically, why abandon a character that had become a hit? We may never know the whole reason, but turmoil at Universal might have played a role. The mid to late 30s and 40s was a time of great financial strife at the company. While the worst of the Depression was behind the country, its knock-on effects were still being felt at all levels. An industry-wide strike in 1934 also left the company without a production at all for months at end. A series of bad loans throughout the 30s also caused the original owners to lose control of their own company, with its financiers eventually purchasing 90% of the company's stock, much more than they even needed for a controlling share. The new owners were looking to maximize their return rather than fund something that had worked for Universal in the past, and wound up canceling all horror productions, filling the schedule with quick-to-make and even cheaper-to-produce low-budget action adventures, musicals, and comedies. Unsurprisingly, the new direction proved unsuccessful, and the studio entered another period of financial difficulty in 1937. The higher-up positions also turned over quickly, becoming a revolving door of company presidents and other C-suite positions. It wouldn't be until 1938, when Universal re-released both Frankenstein and Dracula, that the company got some financial breathing room. Based off of the success of those re-releases, Universal greenlit a sequel to Bride of Frankenstein called Son of Frankenstein, which would prove to be another financial success for the struggling company. Another factor in why The Bride didn't return might have been the Hays Code. For those who aren't aware of what the Hays Code was, the code sought to regulate the content of movies and was the direct predecessor to the MPAA and their rating system that we all know today. The code, though, wound up being far more controlling, and its stated mission was that, quote, "No picture shall be produced which shall lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin." End quote. It was an inherently conservative and Catholic code that the Catholic community of the time openly endorsed, going so far as to get the Pope to write a letter of support. The code had guidelines on everything from crime, sex, vulgarity, to suggestive dances and national sentiment. While its creators might have had good intentions in creating this code, it wound up having a huge effect on the movie industry, and particularly the horror genre. Companies decided to play it safe with formulas that had proven themselves to be predictable and boring, but unchallenging, rather than addressing subjects that might have shocked or scandalized audiences. Another reason might be that World War II started, and a lot of movie studios pivoted to helping the war effort, producing propaganda films and film reels. And the last reason might be that audience expectations had simply changed. While I don't think any serious studies have come out on this, I think audiences just wanted things to distract them from the very real horrors of the Nazis and the war, wanting much lighter fare such as musicals and action films. And as a result, horror movies started to pivot and feature more current fears, such as those related to the nuclear bomb and other science gone wrong. Hence, we get the movies of the 50s, which moved away from the now comical monsters and ghosts to mad scientists. But whatever the reason may be, The Bride's next cinematic appearance in the US would be in Mel Brooks's 1972 classic comedy, Young Frankenstein. In this, the bride is not a creation of Victor Frankenstein's grandson, Frederick Frankenstein, Frankenstein, but rather Frederick's fiancée, Elizabeth, who falls in love with the monster due to his enormous Schwanstucker. Madeline Kahn, who played Elizabeth, is delightfully funny in the role and dons a wig similar to the bride's iconic hair, hissing as she comes out of the bathroom, much to the monster's chagrin. The character would have a different take in the 1973 BBC made-for-TV movie, Frankenstein, The True Story. Here, the bride is played by a young Jane Seymour, who, in a departure from the precedent set in the previous Universal movies, does not wear any prosthetics or monster makeup at all, instead appearing as a beautiful young woman named Prima. As the film progresses and Prima interacts with those around her, it becomes apparent that she's not quite right in the head, and only being used as a stepping stone for Dr. Polidori, a character unique to this film, into high society. His plans come crashing down as Prima would meet her end at the hands of the monster, who, in a quite amazing scene, tears off her head after crashing a high society ball. I highly recommend watching that scene, as it is quite something. Bride of Frankenstein would get an unofficial sequel in 1985 with a movie simply titled The Bride. Starring Jennifer Beals as Ava, the Bride of Frankenstein, the film also features, in a quite bizarre casting choice, Sting as Baron Frankenstein. Ava is created by Baron Frankenstein as an experiment in creating life without the deformities and limitations that his previous creation, the monster, exhibited. Ava is a quick study, rapidly learning how to speak and how to interact with people, but begins to question her place in the world as she begins to integrate into wider society. She has trouble connecting to people and forming bonds with them, but ultimately has a happy ending, with her and the monster traveling to Venice to live in peace. As of this recording, a new bride-centered film is in development by Maggie Gyllenhaal, with a tentative release date of 2025. Details are pretty scarce at this point, but I'm excited to see what she'll do with the character, as this one will have something that no other bride movie can claim, that the bride will be written and directed by a woman. It'll be a fresh perspective on the character, and all I can hope is that it gets released and turns out to be good. The bride might have been forgotten for a long time, but modern audiences are still intrigued by the character. She is a natural foil to Frankenstein's monster, and there is a lot of depth to explore with how two beings who relate to the world around them so differently see themselves fitting into a society and discovering their own humanity. Even though we're approaching the end of this project, I'm still noticing things that I'd like to change about the colors and how I'm applying them to the portrait. As I'm painting, I realized that I really don't like the way I put the parchment down on the neck, and decided to go over it with some light blue violet. And this just goes to show why I like working with acrylics. They dry quickly, so it's easy to correct and change anything that isn't sitting quite right. Now that the portrait is in a good place, a place that I think is almost at its final stages, I'm going to start mixing both the Turner's Yellow and Cadmium Red with a little bit of parchment. That's because I want to add a little bit of opacity to these paints, as otherwise they would be fairly translucent. So why bother with the red and yellow at all if we already have a perfectly serviceable portrait right now with just 3 colors? Well, for me, I really like adding the yellow and red because I feel that it adds an extra visual element that helps bring some more interest into the painting. They also help break up the portrait as your eye moves across the painting. However, if you're not interested in adding these colors, it's perfectly alright to stop where you are with just those 3. Now, what I'm looking for when applying the red and yellow are really 2 things. One is simply places that I think it would look good. And the other is that I'm trying to still follow the lines of the face, so I'm trying to add these colors in places that I feel would make sense, such as the yellow in places where the shadows are a bit light, and red where they might look a little bit harsher, but not quite as dark as the Prussian blue. So now that I've got the red and yellow on the subject, I'm going to apply these colors to the background to add a little bit of cohesion throughout the entire piece. If the red and yellow were just on the face, it would look a little bit strange. So I'm going to take my palette knife and load it up with the red we've been using on the face, and literally drag it down the painting to add this broken texture that I really find compelling and quite fun to make. I'm going to keep scraping the palette knife against the painting, adding the paint little by little until I've got it to a place that I'm happy with. Then I'm going to do the same with the yellow, and because of the nature of this process, both of these colors will slightly mix and create this extremely jagged and extremely interesting interplay between them. Because this process can be pretty messy, I am not going to worry too much if I happen to get some on the face, as we can just paint over that later. Once those two colors have been added to the background, I like to go in with the light blue violet and start to tone back some of the texture we just created. If I didn't, the background would end up competing with the portrait rather than complementing it, and your eye would just be looking at the background instead of the face that we just painted. If you've been following along and sticking with me this far, you should have a finished painting sitting right in front of you. Now that we've finished the painting, it's time for one of the most satisfying and sometimes terrifying parts of this, removing the tape. If I've done everything correctly, the acrylic paint on the tape should just separate from the painting when I pull it up, leaving a nice, clean edge. But what can make this terrifying is, for whatever reason, the paint sometimes will still stick to itself and wind up taking a chunk out of the portrait. Thankfully, that didn't happen this time, but peeling up the tape revealed that I did make a mistake when applying the tape. One of the edges is not as square as the others due to me misjudging the pencil line, so it tracks inward from where it's supposed to be by about 1/8 of an inch. While that's honestly disappointing, it's really not that big a deal, as if we decide to frame this, a mat board can easily cover that up. Once we've got our portrait signed, We're going to go over it with a very light coat of matte medium to help seal in everything and give it a little bit of protection. One other slightly silly mistake that I made with this painting was the choice of marker that I used to sign my name. I had never used this brand before, so when I uncapped it and discovered it was a chisel tip instead of a fine point, well, I just decided to roll with it. The matte will also cover that up if we decide to frame it, so it's not really a big deal. But even if you did make mistakes in your painting, like I did, congratulations are in order because you've done something that a lot of other people haven't. That always deserves credit, even if it didn't turn out the way you wanted. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and thank you for watching this video. I hope I see you next time, and happy painting.